You're listening to Nutrition Matters Podcast with Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist.
Hi everyone, it's Paige Smathers. Thanks so much for being here. Nutrition Matters Podcast explores what really matters in nutrition and health with a sensitive and realistic approach. To help support the podcast, please consider making a donation at positive-nutrition.com/podcast. If you find this episode interesting, engaging, or helpful in your life, please consider donating, sharing with friends and family, and leaving a review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, whatever podcast app you use to listen to this podcast. You can leave a review about this podcast straight from your podcast app. Search Nutrition Matters Podcast, click reviews, and then write a review. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook if you'd like to have a little more food for thought. Thank you for listening. Hi everyone, and welcome to Nutrition Matters Podcast. My name is Paige and I'm your host. And as always, I'm so glad you're here and really excited to share this conversation this week. So this week I'm talking with Sarah Pinnell, who is a psychotherapist in Atlanta, Georgia. She specializes in eating disorders, and she'll explain more about what she does and what her practice is like during the podcast episode. But in this podcast episode, we're talking about what to do if you feel like you wonder whether or not there's a place for you in these conversations about health at every size, or in the non-diet space, or in the intuitive eating conversation. Sometimes if you find yourself with a health concern that really makes it so that you can't eat all the foods, and maybe all foods don't fit for you, or maybe you wonder if it's for you because you disagree with something you heard someone say who represents the non-diet community. We're diving into exploring some of the nuance of this whole conversation that we're having. So many people are having, and so many people are working to create more space and to be more inclusive. But sometimes we just replace one perspective like dieting, or one approach like dieting, and we replace it with just the same thing kind of reincarnated as intuitive eating, or we're just as rigid or all or nothing in our mentality or approach to not dieting as we were to dieting. So we're kind of looking at all of that stuff and making a little bit of critiques and critical examinations of kind of what we think we're doing well and maybe what we think we could do better when it comes to how we communicate about this message. Talking about what alienates people and what we can do better. So I just want to take a minute to kind of talk about the spirit of this whole conversation. So I've heard it said sometimes in different circles and different communities that you shouldn't criticize things because then it weakens the message. And I respect that that's maybe how some people think about things, but I actually see it the other way. I think that when you love something and when you think something is important or valuable, I think you owe it to that thing to kind of be critical and to examine it and to see how it can improve and see how it might be able to do better. So that's the spirit of this. This is not calling anyone out. This is not, trying to be really negative. It's really in the spirit of how can we do better? How can we make this an approach to health and well-being and nutrition and body image and mental health in a way that more and more people can access it. So that's what this is about. So if you are new to the podcast and you haven't heard me say this yet, but I just want to mention you can join us over in the Facebook group. It's Nutrition Matters Podcast Community on Facebook. I'm also on Instagram. And I'm exploring nuance in my Instagram. So if this conversation intrigues you, you might want to join us over there. I'm running a little project on Instagram with the hashtag Nuance Matters, and we're talking about different topics within nutrition and health and well-being that sometimes get really rigid, either on the dieting side or sometimes on the intuitive eating, body positivity side. So if you're interested in that, you join us over there. My handle on Instagram is Paige Smathers RD. And as always, I'm so grateful for any reviews you're willing to give. Take a few minutes, whatever podcast app you use to listen to this, or even on Google Plus. Reviews are always helpful, or even Facebook if you're up for it. So Thanks to all of you for all your support and for sharing, commenting, engaging with the content or in groups or on social media. All of it really means a lot to know that it's reaching people and it's connecting and it's resonating. So thank you so much for all of that support, and please keep it coming. All right, so with that, let's get into talking with Sarah Pennell all about this topic of exploring what it feels like to not fit into some of the cultures and norms of this perspective, and maybe how the non-diet community can do a little bit better, and also messages to anyone who feels like they're on the fence about this whole idea. We have a few words to say to you, so make sure to listen to the end because we talk to you in the end. All right, enjoy. Hi, Sarah. Welcome to Nutrition Matters Podcast.
Hey, Paige.
Thanks so much for coming on the show, and I'm so excited to dive into this topic because honestly, I've mentioned this before on the podcast, but I have a running list of topics that I think I want to dive into, but I need to find that right person. And some of them are like a little controversial. So I'm excited to dive into this with you because I feel like you're such a good fit for exploring this with me. So thanks again for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. And I'm super excited to explore this topic too.
So take a minute, Sarah, and just introduce yourself a little bit. Talk about what you do, and then we'll kind of dive into your personal story just a little bit, and then we'll move into kind of how your personal story and your professional background intersects with this topic at hand today.
Awesome. So yes, I'm Sarah Pennell, and I am a psychotherapist in practice in Atlanta. I have my own private practice here, Whole Embodied Psychotherapy, and I really specialize in treating anxiety, trauma, and eating disorders, and kind of that whole spectrum of disordered eating and body image concerns and all of that. Really, my passion is helping people to kind of learn to trust themselves, their bodies, and kind of redevelop kind of a healthy relationship with themselves and others, basically.
Perfect. So talk a little bit about maybe what brought you into this line of work, and then also any other personal stuff that's related to what we'll be talking about today, and I'll guide you along the way.
Awesome. Actually, it's funny. I didn't want to be a therapist, and I didn't definitely want to work with eating disorders. I actually have my own history of having an eating disorder from about age of 11 or so until after college. So for about 10 years. But basically eventually actually did decide to become a therapist after I guess I went into recovery, realized maybe I'd consider it. I was always fascinated in psychology, but still kind of was like, I'm not going to work with eating disorders. I had an eating disorder. And then started working in this field. And then lo and behold, I started seeing clients with eating disorders and actually realized I really loved working with them, and to some degree I understand it and I get it because I've had my own experience. So I think that's kind of how I got to where I am now. And also really, again, I think also because I love to work with trauma and anxiety and trauma and eating disorders, there's just so much overlap.
Yeah, it's not like you can say, okay, I just treat trauma. I don't treat any of the other effects of trauma, right?
People say that, and it always kind of scares me. But yes. Some people try to say they only treat eating disorders, they don't treat trauma, or they only treat trauma, they don't treat eating disorders, but which I don't really get. But I think for me, there was so much overlap that's kind of how I kind of got into the field. And then I think the thing that we're going to kind of get into today too, which is that I also live with a chronic illness, which kind of basically maybe to overview, my kind of illness kind of presents itself in a variety of ways. I have really loose joints, which makes me really prone to injury and can cause a lot of pain. It basically impacts the functioning of my autonomic nervous system. For anyone listening who doesn't know what that is, basically automatic, those kind of systems of our body that work kind of without you thinking, your heart rate, your blood pressure, body temperature, digestion, immune system functioning, all of those things, all of which I do have symptoms related to at times. Basically, at this point, I understand that most likely this is related to a genetic condition I have, which affects basically all the connective tissue in my body. I'm still learning, still undergoing tests to kind of understand the exact process of this. And in that way, I'll also tell you that my story's not over. I'm still kind of in process. Physiologically, my body still struggles. I'm not healed. And yet over the last few years, I have definitely watched as kind of going through this process of having kind of coming to understand that I have a chronic illness has actually really healed parts of me. And it's also kind of, as we'll kind of get into, I think, more later, also let me kind of face a lot of things that are really hard, even like in terms of the kind of community that we work in. What does it look like to be a clinician and a therapist when sometimes maybe you feel like you don't fit in, at least for me, like I don't necessarily always fit into this non-diet culture when, or this kind of body positive culture. What does it look like to be an intuitive eater when I live with like chronic nausea? What does it look like to kind of talk about body image? Like, isn't body image something that, like, I think sometimes people think like if you heal that, it kind of like when you go through eating disorder recovery, then you kind of like heal body image. And we don't talk about the fact that clinicians continue to have a body image, and that's something that we're continuing to develop. That body image is something that's dynamic. And I think that I've had to kind of work on what does it look like for me to have a relationship with my body and with food now that I have a chronic illness. So
thanks for all of that, Sarah. So a couple comments I wanted to make. The first one was that I really appreciate you saying that you're like still in your own process with figuring out what's going on for you, figuring out what works for you, figuring out what you need to do to care for yourself. I think that, you know, you're pointing that out and highlighting that, but really every single person that's ever come on this podcast, that's true for them too. And every single person that we run across on social media or friends that we have in real life, whatever it may be, we tend to kind of think in terms of before and after. And we can kind of get into that mentality of like, okay, yeah, let's interview the person who overcame a wonderful thing or a difficult thing in a wonderful way. And while that's really valuable, that narrative, I think it's also really important to kind of explore the fact that we aren't before and afters. We're always in our own process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that we really need to talk about more as clinicians, which is creating the space that as clinicians, we are still very much human and still very much still developing, still growing. I hope that, 10 years from now, I know more than I know now. Like, I hope there's always going to be growth and change.
Right.
And talking about that and making that not taboo or scary or bad, that to kind of say, yeah, I'm human. I still have struggles. Like, I'm still learning. I'm still, figuring out what it looks like to have my body. And that's okay. Like to live in my body and take care of my body is something that I'm still learning. And I think we can relate to our clients better when we do that, when we bring our humanity into the room. So
awesome. I totally agree. So I want to kind of dive into some parts of your story that I'm not really familiar with, but I think will kind of bring us into this topic at hand of talking about what do you do when you feel like all foods can't fit for you, or when you feel like you don't fit in with maybe the culture or the narratives that are kind of prevalent in some of the communities and circles we run in. So let's just take a minute to talk about, how did you find intuitive eating? Was that in your process of recovery? Was that professionally? How did you find Health at Every Size? What was your process like? And kind of, I know to do this work, we have to do a lot of personal work. So I'm interested to hear about that process for you.
Yeah. So I first got introduced to intuitive eating by my dietitian when I was starting my recovery. And so that's when I first got introduced to it, and I remember just thinking like this was like this like game changer when I learned it. And yet I will also say again, I think I learned it like most people do when I was in like my recovery from an eating disorder. So I think even as I developed and started to understand intuitive eating, there was still probably some rigidity around it. And I can say, I think now in retrospect, that I think again, it was very much a game changer. It definitely was like really kind of critical to my kind of recovery, was kind of learning to like let go of trying to like manipulate food to kind of manipulate my body size and shape, and learning to kind of to listen to my body and like learn about hunger and fullness and all these things, like and kind of like challenging kind of these diet rules and all of that. I think in retrospect, the one thing I can say I see now is I think the one place that I kind of would always continue to get trapped, and I think this is true for a lot of people, was when it came to health. Because though I will kind of say like about 3 years ago, I really got sick, or what I would now understand to like really flared up to kind of the kind of experience that I now live with. But I've basically had health concerns basically my entire life. I would now kind of looking back, I can see I had these kind of flares, from the time I was probably in elementary school. But to think that always the way again that I didn't know that I had the disease I had then. So I think I always kind of felt like, oh, like I must just like have the worst immune system ever. Like I must just be like accident prone, or like, am I just like not as strong as everyone else? Am I just like a hypochondriac? Or why do I always get sick? Why do I always get injured? And I think I internalized a lot of it. And in that way, I think also in a lot of ways, I learned not to trust my body, because I remember having joint pain when I was like 8 years old, and people being like, wait, what's like, no, you're fine. And being like, oh, so I must just be fine. This must just be in my head. I can't trust my body. And again, like I didn't say that obviously at 8 years old, but I think looking back, I think that was one of the messages I learned.
That's so hard.
There. But yeah, I think that one of those places I think I would always get stuck with intuitive eating was around kind of the idea of health, because I wanted to be quote unquote healthy. And there's all of these messages in our culture about food and health, and kind of using food, kind of again, that food is medicine, like using kind of like eating in a certain way for your health. And I kind of, for a lot of years, I think I kind of separated. I was like, well, I'm not doing this. This isn't eating disorder. This isn't like disordered eating. This is because I'm doing it for my health. And so I'd always still kind of get sucked back into these different kind of like health kind of still diets, really. And then eventually I think I even kind of moved out of that. As I became a therapist and was treating more people with eating disorders, I even kind of said like, okay, like I started to see kind of the flaws in that mentality.
So can we explore that just for a minute?
Yes.
So this is hard, because I think to me, the distinction is, well, first of all, let me lay the groundwork. So I think that it's fine to want to engage in your health and to want to be healthy. You feel good when you're healthy, all that. Like, no one's saying that health is bad here. But at the same time, I think the distinction between what you were talking about of how health kind of roped you back into some of these diets is this assumption that you can manipulate your health, or that you can control your health completely. To me, that seems important, maybe something to dig into. What do you think?
No, definitely. Yeah, and I'm really glad you said that, because I definitely think, I think the pursuit of health, again, I think it's widening the definition of health. I think when we get sucked into health as just kind of narrowing it down to like our physiological functioning, and not looking at that health is also social relationships and our mental health and our emotional health, and kind of a whole person well-being, I think is when we kind of get trapped. And I think this became even more apparent for me when I really got sick about like a few years ago. I was actually pretty opposed at that point, actually, truthfully, to like doing anything related to food. And then I think as it got progressively worse and worse and worse, I found myself kind of in this place of feeling so desperate that I found myself kind of like wrestling with like, should I go back on like kind of an elimination diet, doing these things, which again are very kind of trendy. And again, I remember feeling like there wasn't really anyone kind of talking about any other options. And I'd gone through a lot of tests and things like that. And I think I already mentioned on here, like, but one of the symptoms I have is like chronic nausea. Explain what happened. So about 3 years ago, it seemed like out of nowhere, literally from 1 week to the next, I went from training for basically a sprint triathlon to having the most horrible fatigue I have ever experienced, not being able to like walk my dog because I would like lose my balance, like barely being able to go get my clients from the waiting room. And then kind of had this like horrible, like flu-like debilitating nausea kind of onset to the point that eventually it became a daily occurrence. It still is actually, and at that time it was so completely distressing. I had no idea what was going wrong. And here I am, this eating disorder therapist that helps people heal their relationship with food and their bodies. And despite my best effort, I was actually struggling to feed myself. I remember like actually reaching out to one of our colleagues who's a non-diet HAES dietitian during this, because at first I was like very opposed. I was like, I don't want to mess with food. I have my own eating disorder history. I kind of had realized I think that was not probably going to be something that was helpful. That was kind of, again, my intuition. But then I was really, really sick and I was losing a lot of weight and just really struggling to even, again, kind of nourish my body. I had really early satiety. I had no appetite. And again, didn't really know what was going on. So I kind of got to this point where like I got really desperate and eventually decided like, and I had different doctors and naturopaths and different things like suggesting like, well, if you, I remember even having a naturopath literally being like, well, do you want to get better? Because if you want to get better, then you need to eat like this.
Okay, so what was that about?
Yeah, and at first I was like, no, I totally disagree with you. Like, and it was like I had this strong reaction against him, and then I think you get really desperate. And again, I think there's some vulnerability in saying this because like here I am in this kind of our community, like of this kind of non-diet community, and feeling like, but what do I do? Like, but my body's not working. Like, I don't believe in diets or doing elimination diets, but like, what do I do? I'm really sick, and it's like there's nothing. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help. And so I think eventually, like, I did actually kind of go on actually 2 different rounds of different, like, kind of protocols of these kind of elimination diets. And what I can say is I won't say that I don't think that food has any effect. Again, is what you were saying earlier. Like, I think that it did alleviate some symptoms, but it never healed me. I think that's a really key part. Like, this never healed me. And it came at a really high price, And I think that's kind of what you were asking earlier, which is that I think when we kind of focus on food as the solution, it oversimplifies the fact that our bodies are really complex systems, and there's typically a lot of different factors at play more than just food.
More than just like nutrients and eating. Yeah, exactly. And again, even food is more complex than that, let alone our entire bodies and our psychology and everything else.
Yeah. And I'll say something that may be kind of controversial, but I don't really think it should be, but which is like, if I had actually been able to do this and there'd been some food I had found that like eliminated all of my symptoms so that I no longer had nausea and like made my body work, like I wouldn't eat that food, like, of course.
Yeah, of course. That's
I would adjust my diet not to have that. Just like if you had an allergy or if you have celiac disease, like not all foods fit. Like, and I think that sometimes I think in our non-diet world, we don't always acknowledge like the people for whom, like when they say like, when we kind of say like, I eat gluten, I eat sugar, I eat all these different things. But what about for the people who have celiacs? Like they can't eat. Like eating gluten is actually really not good for their bodies. Like eating peanuts isn't helpful if you have a peanut allergy. Like, so I will say that like, again, had I found something that, really alleviated all my symptoms, like I would change my diet to do it. I think what I found though, at the same time though, is that, and I think this is where we have to have an incredible amount of caution. And I think we're really quick to jump to therapeutic diets, quote unquote, therapeutic diets or elimination diets or health diets, whatever you want to call them. I think we're really quick to, or they're not necessarily non-diet people, but a lot of the world is very quick to prescribe these without an acknowledgement of the cost. And that's I think really even when I went through it, I got to see that firsthand. Because I think we don't talk about how much stress it causes. We don't talk about the financial cost. A lot of times eating this way is really expensive. Like it creates a lot of time preparing. And I also had no energy at the time. And it requires mental energy. It makes it harder to go to restaurants, like because you have to worry about all the different ingredients that are in things. And also I'd say like most of the people who are doing this, it's because they are sick. They're already not feeling well. People don't want to go on these elimination diets because they're feeling great, right?
Sometimes it's a matter of like, oh, this is trendy and I'm going to try this new thing, But yeah, in general, I'm feeling terrible and I want to try to figure out what the heck is going on with me.
Yeah, and I think the kind of more extreme things. I think a lot of times when people are going in the more extreme kind of like, I'm eliminating all this stuff or going on some of these kind of like things, it's because sometimes, and I think when you're sick, and you're sick and you don't know what's going on. And this is where I have a lot of empathy for people who come in and like sometimes, again, I think they feel bad kind of like doing this to some degree. Like I felt a lot of like internal conflict doing it. But I think, again, it's like being sick on and of itself is really stressful. And I can also say that the whole point of kind of elimination diets is to like, and I kind of went into it like, I'm going to do this with a lot of curiosity. Like, I don't want to have foods eliminated. I want to be able to like reintroduce them. And I think also like, but I was also really desperate for a solution. And I think that makes it really, really hard for people to be objective. Like humans in general are not vulnerable. Great at being objective. And when you're told that foods are potentially what is going to cause harm or potentially what the solution is, like that creates a lot of energy around that food.
Exactly. So I'm really interested to know, like, going through all of this, being in the field of treating eating disorders, going through all of this yourself, being aware of, you know, the non-diet message. And really, if we put this into context, this stuff is kind of gaining more traction, you know, just in the last few years, at least from my assessment. I don't claim to be an expert on, you know, the entire broad picture of the entire conversation among professionals and just generally. But to me, it seems like this is really something that's being talked about more mainstream. People are thinking about this stuff. So when you came across this, given what you were going through, how did you feel knowing like, wait, maybe not all foods can fit for me? And like, do I have a place in, you know, this non-diet message, and will I be accepted? Do I fit in? Like, did you go through that? And if so, I'm interested to know what that was like.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, like, I think in retrospect, I think truthfully there was a degree where I didn't talk about it a ton while I was going through it. I mean, I was definitely in consultation with people, like, because I did have some concerns, like, how does this impact, like, I'm always aware of, like, what I'm doing going to impact my clients? So I was in consultation, and I was working with a dietitian, like a Hays dietitian, that one of our colleagues and stuff like that. So, I mean, I had people around me who knew. And I think more broadly, it was hard for me to talk about because I did kind of fear that people might judge me. And I also think it was kind of hard because one of the things for me is that even still, like, I don't have consistent like hunger and fullness signals. Like I tend to have like early satiety, like, which basically means, like, people don't know what that means. Basically, like, I would eat a few bites of food and like be like kind of Thanksgiving Day full, like really full before like I was kind of like adequately nourished. And not being able to, like, sometimes again, because of the way my nervous system works, and like sometimes I don't necessarily feel hungry, like, even though I know I need to eat, like, because I can tell by other ways that I have, like, energy wise, and just like knowing that I need to be able to like keep nourishing my body, but I may not have some signal that says I'm hungry. And again, I think there's kind of that, it felt like, oh, but to be an intuitive eater, you're supposed to like listen to your hunger and stop when you're full, right? Aren't those kind of like some of those too early premises? Like, what happens when you can't do that? When my body doesn't work that way?
Yeah. And there's so many people listening who I'm sure relate to that exact thing, because, you know, even when someone's body is functioning just fine in terms of they are getting hunger and fullness cues, like a lot of times they're so disconnected from their body, or they're so not used to even paying attention, that it can be such a process to get to the point where you're able to do that. So sometimes we act as if it's just that easy, like, oh, let's just honor hunger and honor fullness. And while I think that that's a helpful message for a lot of people, I also think it's really important to explore the idea that, like, there are a lot of people who kind of need to eat and nourish themselves based on more of like the clock, or based on more of like an amount that they know is adequately nourishing to them. Does that jive with what you're saying?
Yeah, totally. And I think even when we think about, like, even just when you get really stressed, like, I think it's going to be harder sometimes to notice, like, when you're hungry, like maybe even if you normally have hunger and fullness signals, like just if you get stressed, that's going to affect anyone's autonomic nervous system, you know, like, And so I think that a lot of people experience this even maybe on lesser degrees. And then there are obviously a lot of people who, yeah, they may not have, maybe because they're disconnected from their body. We know people actually, if they're in early recovery, a lot of times don't have good, connection because of the eating disorder to like hunger and fullness signals. And so I think part of me also just wants to kind of like challenge the message and say like, that's not the gold standard. You are not a better human being if you are connected to hunger and fullness. If you eat based upon hunger and fullness, I think it's also like removing the morality from intuitive eating. Like you're not a better person if you eat this way. Like,
yes, that is something I want to just underscore and highlight. Like if moving toward an intuitive eating approach is creating guilt, shame, just another rubric for whether or not you're a good person or you're worthy or you're moral, that's something to really call into question and shine a light on and notice about yourself, because that is definitely not the goal.
And I think we as clinicians and we both got to know each other on Instagram. And again, I probably am guilty of this at times too, that I think when we're posting these things, and again, we're posting little memes, so it's like, you've got to be quick and catchy and say things. But I think we need to be careful too, that we are not spreading that message too, of kind of like moralizing or making it like better, like eating when you're hungry or being mindful eating is another one. Mindful eating's kind of also gotten taken up by a lot of diet culture too. But, I think again, even that idea of like being mindful of like the eating process, I can tell you that for me, if you kind of do one of those like mindful eating exercises where you like sit and have to like, pay attention to the taste and the texture and smell and all these things. And that's a wonderful exercise. I actually do it with clients sometimes. For me, most days, if I try to do that exercise, it's going to make me super sick. Like, I'm going to feel really horrible doing it just because of kind of the nausea and things like that. So for me, the idea of like trying to be mindful as in like present in that moment when I am eating all the time, especially when I'm really sick, when it's really flared up and I'm at my worst, the idea of like trying to like sit there and be present at every meal is kind of torturous, like, and I don't actually think is helpful. And so one of the things for me, one of the learning processes for me is learning like mindfulness for me sometimes is being mindful in the preparation. And I hope that, I don't know if this will be helpful for other people to hear, is being mindful in the preparation versus the idea that mindful needs to be like, you need to be paying attention to the entire process of while you're eating. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And this is, okay. I think that what I'm hearing you say and what crosses my mind probably on a daily basis is this idea of like, when we are in diet culture and we're told you should do this and you shouldn't do that, and rules and rigidity, and this is how you do it and this is the result, we're so used to thinking that way. And when we approach intuitive eating, mindful eating, body positivity, whatever you even, whatever resonates or whatever you're thinking about right now, when you approach that as a polar opposite of dieting, I think that we see problems, because then we're just applying the exact same mindset toward body positivity, for example, as we were with like body manipulation, where it's like, wow, any now that I'm doing this body positivity thing, I can't have any negative thoughts about my body or else I'm failing at it. Or I can't ever struggle, or I can't ever have a bad body image day, or I can't ever think about weight loss ever again, or whatever. It's this, if this stuff is leading to those types of, self-guilt and self-flagellation, it's like, that's not the point of them. It's to free you and liberate you from that.
Yes. I'm absolutely with you.
And,
I think again,
and freedom and liberation is going to look different for different people with different histories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think the point really of intuitive eating, I think, is intuition, reconnecting to what it is that you need, learning that we can trust our bodies. Like, I think that's for me, like, it took me a while getting sick to learn that, like, I really can trust my body. Like, again, I told you early on that like when I was young, I think I learned as much that I couldn't trust my body because I kind of learned not to listen to it because it was like experiencing pain or experiencing these different things. And I think for me, it's learning that actually, like I look back now and I'm like, actually my body was telling me something was wrong. Like I can trust my body. Like my body can give me cues that I can use. And so for me, again, like that may not be that, again, my body may not be able to give me like accurate hunger and fullness signals. Like, okay, but I still have an intuition. I can still learn to connect to my body, and I can connect based upon like energy levels. And again, sometimes that can get a little wonky too, but there are ways that I've kind of learned of what works best for my body. And sometimes even for me, like that's the wisdom to create a structure that works for me. So sometimes when I'm really sick, like I will actually set reminders on my phone, like to remind myself to eat. Like,
I did the same thing when I was pregnant because like you're feeling terrible and the last thing in the world you want to do is eat, but you know you need to. And yeah, sometimes you go through different like seasons of life or seasons with your health, whatever it might be, that you know, food isn't a super intuitive thing and it is more of a chore, or it is something you just have to like kind of cross off your list. I also think we run into this. I'm interested to hear what you think about this. Yeah. We run into similar ways of thinking when, you know, well-intentioned people are saying, you know, enjoy your food. You should eat tasty, delicious food. It's so fun. And, you know, I think that there's total value in that. Like, yeah, like don't order the salad if you really want the pizza and the salad is going to be boring and bland and the pizza is going to be delicious to you. Like that's not great. But at the same time, there is a time and a place to just, you know, sometimes food is just food and it's not always amazingly blow your mind delicious. And I think we can also set ourselves up for feeling like a failure if we feel like every single time we eat, it has to be this like monumental, incredible experience.
Absolutely. I could not agree with you more, Paige. Like, and I think that's been, again, a lot of like my own learning experience too, is learning that sometimes for me, it's having to make peace with the fact that sometimes actually like eating like is not actually enjoyable at all. Sometimes it's actually, as you said, it's kind of a chore. It's something that like I am doing because I know I need to nourish my body and it doesn't feel good. Like if you're really sick, it's not fun to actually eat when you're really, really nauseous. Like, I think that's not surprising to anyone. Like
we've all been there. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. I think sometimes for me, like being mindful in the preparation means that like I have a bunch of different like options based upon like kind of how I feel. Like, so if sometimes for me, it's like if the nausea is more like I really have a hard time swallowing, I'll have options that are like more like liquid type options. Or if it's like really taste, then it's like having bland options. Like, and it's whatever's kind of tolerable in that moment is kind of, I think that's kind of for me what I need. And then also, I think it's giving myself permission to then actually be distracted. Because I think this is, again, one of like the rules of mindful eating, which is that we've demonized like eating distracted, you know, like, yeah. I feel like it's become this like, really this like, it's always kind of crazy to me too. Cause it's like, no one's ever going to be mindful all the time what they eat. But I feel like that's kind of this like mindful eating diet rule, which is like, never eat like in front of the TV, never eat when you're distracted. And I can tell you like when I'm at my worst, it's like, no, I get food. And then if I need to, then it's like, I do something else so I can get the food into my body. Cause that's ultimately like my goal in that moment is to like nourish my body. And I think it's been really important for me to learn that like I can be in my body and I can be present with the pain. I can be present with the nausea, but I also don't want to do that 6 times a day. Like that's going to make it harder for me to like nourish my body well if I have to like sit there and really notice and feel how nauseous I am. Like,
well, and I think mindfulness, you know, elevates us beyond that. I'm hoping like in the, it's intended to be mindful and aware of what works for you and what doesn't, and to choose to honor that. But you're right. It can kind of be, for lack of a better word, kind of bastardized and turned into like this oversimplified new set of rigid black and white all or nothing rules that then create guilt and rigidity and dysfunction.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think that's all these things that, again, I realized, again, I didn't even realize I had some of these rules around it till all of a sudden I wasn't able to do it. Like even for me to realize, because I would feel this shame that it's like, why do I feel ashamed that like I turn on the TV when I eat? I'm like, because I feel like I should be like more aware of like and noticing it. And I'm like, why? Like if that doesn't help me, if that's not working for my body and my intuition, which again I think is like, or mindfulness of like non-judgment, why do I feel like I have to do that? Because it's a rule, you know?
Right. And I think that one of the ways that you can be tipped off on when those rules are coming up is when you say that type of when you use that type of language of I should be doing this, or I shouldn't be thinking this, or I should be that those shoulds and shouldn'ts really imply a lot of rule type thinking.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely.
So what do you think broadly, talking about, you know, all the people in the non-diet community, in the body positive community, health at every size, it's really tricky to put messages out into the world that are relevant, that relate to people, that hit the mark, but also express a hefty dose of like, well, if you're over here, this might be helpful. If you're over on this other end of the spectrum, this might be helpful. Like, it's a tough thing to do. And so I'm not trying to say like, I have it all figured out by any means, but what do you see as messaging from people who have really good intentions to help people walk away from diets? What do you see as being particularly alienating, whether that was your own experience or whether that's feedback you've gotten from clients?
I think, again, I think one of the things is watching our own kind of rigidity of using all or nothing kind of language. You know, even that phrase like all foods fit, like, which we throw out all the time, you know? And I think realizing that that may not be true for someone. Like, as we've said, like if you have like an allergy, if you have celiacs, like you may not be able to eat all foods. Like that doesn't mean that you are somehow like deficient or like you're not like practicing, you know, being intuitive or like, and again, I think that doesn't mean like intuitive eating is also not accessible to you. Because I think that actually I probably am a more like attuned, intuitive, mindful like eater now than I've been at any other point in my life. And yet again, as I said, like I don't necessarily always eat in response to hunger and fullness. Like if those aren't, I don't have those cues, I don't do that.
So that's a really great point. Even in the messaging about, you know, the non-diet, it can be, we can use that all or nothing language. And so I think being aware of words like you shouldn't do this or you should do that or always or never or all that kind of stuff can be something to just be aware of. But then at the same time, and I think I've mentioned this before on the podcast, but it's also, you have to be careful to not approach your messaging like, okay, I'm trying to never use all or nothing language, because that in of itself is like really rigid, right? So you just, it's so tricky to like exist in this nuanced gray area, but it's not comfortable, but I think it's ultimately what's helpful.
Well, we've got to allow the space for us to make mistakes. And I think that's so much of it is I think it is the humility of realizing that we're going to make mistakes. And I think, and it's listening to people when people say, oh my gosh, like that actually is really hard for me to hear. Then we listen and we say, oh, like, help me understand that. Like, how can I use language that's more inclusive? You know, I think that's been really for me is I want to keep kind of listening and learning, like thinking about being inclusive of people. And so sometimes that's saying like, using the language of like, this may be helpful. Again, moving from that should language to may,
okay,
you know, this
I like that.
may be helpful. Like giving people permission, like you have permission to do this. And also, it's okay if you're not here. You know, I think a lot of the ways that I write, a lot of times I post, it's like, it's okay to do this. It's okay to do this versus saying like, you
should be. That's good.
Yeah.
I like that. Also, I just want to point this out that the new goal isn't to not diet. So sometimes I feel like people are thinking in terms of what did I used to do when I dieted? And now that I'm not dieting anymore, I need to do the exact opposite of that because I'm not dieting. So just being careful of not applying that label of like, okay, now my new goal is to not diet. I don't think that that's the goal. I think the goal is simply to care for yourself in a way that feels good and promotes your well-being. And so really just, that's where, I don't know, that's one of the things that the shifts in language that I think can be helpful for people is to recognize, oh my gosh, what is my goal in my head? Is it to not diet? All right, I need to work on shifting that so that it's a little bit more grounded in what's right for me.
Yeah. And I think one of the language I really love to use is, again, using the language more of invitation, like inviting people into things versus, again, like telling people what to do. Because the telling people what to do kind of takes to the place that, like, I'm an expert. Like, even like sharing what I'm sharing today, like, I want to be really clear that I'm not trying to say, like, because I did this, you should do this. And again, it's more like I'm offering my experience, but also hopefully my real goal is I want to invite people to get curious about their own experience and what works for them. Because that's ultimately what I kind of had to do was eventually was to get curious about what was going to work for me.
Exactly. I love that. The language of invitation is super powerful. But I also want to I want to give a little bit of time and attention to a very real thing that's gone on that I've observed in sort of the culture that surrounds these ideas. Is there is a lot of potentially like alienating language, and there is a lot of should and shouldn't, and there is a lot of sort of forming some of these norms of how we speak, of how we do things. And if you say something the wrong way, or if you do this behavior, then you're kind of clearly not invited, right? So I think that there is that phenomenon going on, and I just want to kind of speak to that so that if anyone's feeling like, gosh, I don't fit in with that because I do have this allergy, or I do have this health concern, or I'm still kind of trying to figure out what all of this is, and I'm not totally sure it's for me, or if I fit in, or if I have to be that kind of strong and strident in my views on this. Do I even fit in? Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's trying to figure out how do we, again, be inclusive? Like, how do we invite people into this space? Like, also, like, recognizing where people are and that we have unique bodies. And again, I know the campaign you're doing, like, the nuance matters. I think it's inviting the nuance. I think it's also inviting more stories. I was telling you this earlier, but like I had a conversation with Hillary Canavy. I don't know if she's ever been on this podcast either, but who is another HAES kind of professional in our field. So I think when I was having this conversation with Hillary, like about these movements are still new, that like the non-diet movement, the HAES community, all of these things, these are like newer movements, and there's still a need. She kind of used the phrase that like we're still birthing these movements in many ways. Like there's still a need for nuance in this, and the need, I think, for people to tell their individual stories, because otherwise we're just going to go to rigidity. As we're just going to go, it's just going to be another iteration of kind of like diet culture. One, we're fighting the fact that diet culture wants to keep co-opting our language, but then also I think if we're not actually actively kind of like listening and seeking to be inclusive of more people with individual experiences, like we're going to just become another iteration of kind of just rigidity and diet culture, another set of rules of like how someone is supposed to live their life. You're supposed to be the non-diet, body positive person, and we're going to be exclusive. And I think that's a problem when we start to become exclusive too, when I think the whole point of like body positive is to help people. Like it started with trying to help people who were marginalized to feel like they, like, to give them a voice, to give them a space. And if we are then marginalizing other people, like we've missed the point.
Agree. Strong agree on that one. And one of the things that comes up for me is thinking about, how can we do better? So you've mentioned to kind of maybe think about our language and it be more invitational in how we talk about these things, be maybe more a little bit aware of when we're using all or nothing language ourselves, be aware of when rigidity and kind of rules-oriented advice is being given. Is there anything else you would add to that?
I think even this discussion, because we kind of started this discussion of health too, is widening the lens to make sure that we don't go into the same trap that I think kind of the diet's kind of gone into, which is like making health so much about kind of like physiological functioning. Because I think for me, one of the things I've realized over the last couple of years, like I am so much more than how my body physiologically functions on any given day. I like my life, my health, like are much more than that too. And I think when we can kind of intuitive eating again, kind of this idea that like, oh, like just eat when you're hungry, stop when you're full, reject the diet rules, and then you'll feel great, and then your body is going to like function great. Like, so I think even there's that kind of, and that's kind of more going to eating disorder community world, that a lot of people have GI issues and things like that. And they feel like, oh, well, once you kind of recover from your eating disorder and once you kind of like, you're doing intuitive eating, like all that's going to go away. Sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, and that really sounds like a diet, right? Where it's like, use this to get this promised outcome. And fundamentally, that's not what all of this is. It's not promising an outcome, which again isn't very sexy. It's not like, oh, do this and let's see what happens. It's like, who wants to do that? But I think it's also being cognizant and aware that that's one of the things that diets do so well, is make promises that they really can't keep.
Yeah, and I think we need to be careful that we don't do the same, that all of a sudden like do this and then you'll have this wonderful life, and then look at me posting all my pictures of like me eating ice cream and cookies and how it's just great and wonderful. And again, like I post pictures of me eating cookies too, and because I am really grateful for the days where like I do feel good and like food is good, like I really appreciate that. I have a new appreciation for that. And I think that kind of like not oversimplifying that into just it being just kind of about like bodies as being these kind of like just like physiological functioning, that like we are whole human beings, and like that is social, emotional, and physical, and kind of like making sure that we highlight that. And I'd say the other thing would be embracing our own humanity as clinicians too. I think that's a way that we can kind of challenge some of this kind of diet culture, is to kind of show up and say like, yeah, I'm still human. Like, it's messy. It's hard. Like, talk about the things that are hard.
That's so helpful when I see people doing that. It's that humanity piece that I think sometimes I feel very uncomfortable with even calling myself an expert, because it's like, whoa, I feel like I'm learning every day, and I feel like there's never going to be a time where I'm like, yep, I've arrived, I know it. And the thing is too, that things change in terms of what people are talking about when it comes to nutrition and bodies and what's trendy and what people are struggling with. And, we weren't talking about gut health and GI stuff as much even, 5 years ago. Things change and evolve, and so that you're never done.
Yeah. And I think when we start to bring the stories and we start to bring like kind of just like the messiness of being human, I think we invite other people to then share their stories. Because when we kind of just act like, oh, this is just wonderful and great, I don't think it really feels very safe, or it doesn't even create even that like kind of like space for people to, like, when we have the courage to share ourselves, I think then we create space for other people to have the courage to share theirs and to share where it's hard and where they're struggling. And I think that's how we're going to create more space in this community to be more inclusive, is when we're brave enough to start sharing our stories and the kind of nuance and the messiness. And then we invite other people to do the same. And then we listen. When other people come and they say, this isn't fitting, like, I don't know where I fit here, we say, tell me more. Like, how can we do better? I think that would be kind of the thing I would say, is just kind of, and again, for all of us, and to have a lot of, again, self-compassion, because like, we're not going to get it right. We're going to say the wrong things. Like, but I think if we're listening, I think if we're listening to people and open to like hearing people's unique experiences and willing to kind of share ours, I think we'll keep growing, and I think this movement will keep kind of being able to have the nuance.
Thanks for that. That was so beautifully said. Really, really loved that. So if someone is feeling kind of like, ooh, is this for me? Or like, can I fit in here? Or, ooh, some of the things that I've seen people post on social media that are part of the non-diet community have just really not resonated with me, or they've maybe even offended me, or they just don't jive with who I want to be, what would you say to that person?
I feel you. I've been there. And I would say you do have a place. Like, and we need you. I'd say we need you. We need your voice. We need those people who have unique stories. We need you. And I think finding the people who are open to, like, I think there are people in our community who are really open to listening, and we're not going to be getting it right all the time. But I think there are many in this community who are willing to listen. And if and when you're able, again, I totally get that if you're in a really vulnerable spot, you may not be able to, and it's not necessarily someone's job, like, especially if you're kind of being marginalized, to, like, to educate others, but also to say, like, if and when and how you're able to share, because I think we do need to learn. And I think that's, again, our job is to try and be seeking out to learn and to listen, but also for those who feel on the outside to find those who are kind of trying at least to create that space, and to share your story as you feel comfortable doing so.
That's beautiful, Sarah. I love the idea of, like, we need you, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think the more people who hear messages and then just say, "Oh, that's not for me. I'm not even going to give that the time or any of my time or energy." I think we end up missing out on what we could have learned from that person, or how we could do better, or how we could alter the way we talk about things to resonate better. So that's a really great point. And then the other thing I wanted to add is I feel really strongly about this, and I, again, like, a little nervous saying some of this stuff because I don't want to come off as controversial or trying to poke people, but I also want you to know that not every person who labels themselves or identifies as being a non-diet practitioner sees the world the same way, and not everyone has the exact same opinions. So just because you see someone say something somewhere, whether it's social media or a podcast or a blog or whatever, doesn't mean that you can say, "Oh, well, all the people in that community all think that exact same way," or that is the opinion of that whole community. Like, there are so many people doing this work, and so many people who are in their own processes. We all are. And I think that it would be, if we all got in the same room together, that would be fantastic. And I think we'd we'd make a lot of progress being able to actually talk to each other. But I think that you'd find that there's people who approach this in infinite different ways. And so just really, we're talking about applying some nuance to intuitive eating and how we approach food and how we approach health. But I also think we need to apply a hefty dose of nuance in how we take in this information and what labels we apply on people, and just be careful about some of that, because that can, I'll just say, like, I've seen stuff and come up in social media or wherever, and I've been like, "Whoa, that's not, I don't agree with that," so.
And I would say with that too, that just because, I think there's a balance here. Just because someone's saying and it makes you uncomfortable, doesn't mean that that's wrong. Sometimes lean into that discomfort, because sometimes people are saying things that are helpful.
Good point.
And also, yeah. I would say on the opposite side, just because someone is an influencer on social media or they have a bunch of letters after their name, that doesn't mean that they're right either. Like, sometimes those of us, like, sometimes we are, like, we're in the wrong. Sometimes we are missing something. Like, we're all human, and as you said, we're all in a process. And so just because, I think that's what you're getting at to some degree, but just because you see something on Instagram by this person who has a PhD and has 100,000 followers doesn't mean that what they are saying is any more valid than your experience. Like, actually, totally. I would say again, like, your experience and your lived experience in your body, like, really matters. And therefore, like, if someone's saying something and saying, like, this is how you should be, and that's not your lived experience, don't assume that they're right. Like,
perfect. And another point to just add on to that is they could be right, but it could be not right for you. And so like there's so much nuance to just think about and to sit with and to just let it be messy, because I loved the point you made that someone might say something that makes you uncomfortable. It doesn't necessarily mean it's not true. You might want to lean into that. But then, this other scenario of maybe it is true for a lot of people, but maybe it isn't really true for some people or for you personally. And so I think this is why we're all so darn anxious in today's world. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Because I think we're trying to like get it right. And I think that's the opposite of intuitive eating. That is diet culture is trying to get it right. That's the perfectionism. That is all of this, like, our cultural mandate to get it right and to be perfect. And I think intuition is kind of the opposite of saying, lean into your experience. Trust that you have wisdom inside of you. Like I tell my clients all the time, I am not the expert on your life. Like I'm not in your body. Like I need your help here because you so often already have the answers inside of you. It's
totally
helping
agree.
people to access those.
Yeah, totally. Oh, this is powerful stuff. And it's, I think we could talk about this forever, Sarah, because it's such an important concept and thing to think about. And I personally, if I had a minute to just talk to people who are on the fence about approaching a more gentle, compassionate approach to food and their body and health and all of that, I would just say, just reiterate, we've already said it, but just reiterate, I want you here. You're welcome here. And you're important and your story matters. And you are the expert of your body. And we're just here to kind of give you some ideas and take what you want and leave what you don't. That's my thought. What would you say to someone?
No, absolutely. I love what you said. Yeah, that I think that you have a place here. We want you and we want you to if this is beneficial, we want you as a part of our community, help us to learn how to be more inclusive. And and I think, again, I think so much of this is learning to figure out what works for you and being curious, because that's going to take time and you're not going to get it right. None of us are going to get it right. No one on Instagram can tell you how to do it exactly. Even when you work with a professional, I can't tell my clients what to do because I don't know. I can be with them, I can support them, I can help them to access their wisdom, but I can't tell them what to do because I don't live in their bodies. And so I think that's to kind of be aware of that too, that just because someone, learn to kind of trust yourself and hopefully follow people who encourage you to trust yourself too. I was gonna say, if an account is telling you makes you feel bad about yourself and makes you less likely to trust yourself, maybe that's not a great person to be following, or seeking out their advice,
Absolutely.
Seek people who want you to be more of you.
Love it. Love it. Love it. So Sarah, take a minute to just talk about how people can find you and follow along with the stuff you put out into the world.
Yeah. So, as I said, I am in private practice in Atlanta. And so I see clients here. My website, which hopefully I may start having more stuff on. It's kind of sparse right now, but hopefully maybe in the not too distant future, there'll also be a blog on there and some posts there, which is www.psychotherapy.org. And then you can also follow me. The place I'm most active is on Instagram. I love Instagram. So you can come follow me there, which I am whole_embodied_therapist. Yeah. And then I also have Facebook, but most of that stuff is really reposted for the most part from Instagram. So really, if you want to connect with me, come follow me on Instagram. I love to connect with people there.
Yay. Awesome.
So yeah.
Thanks, Sarah, so much for being here. This was really really important conversation. I'm hoping it's helpful for people to know that they're welcome and they're wanted and they're needed, and just to kind of humanize the fact that you've felt kind of on the outs or wondered, do I fit in? I'll also say, totally felt that way and still kind of do sometimes. And I'm sure a lot of people are like, wait, what? You're totally talking about this all the time on a podcast. But I think it's human nature to feel like, do I fit in? And does this message work for me? And do people like me? And is there a place for me? And I think that I just want to say yes to all of that.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Paige, for having me. I have loved having this conversation as well. And and thank you for creating the space to have this conversation, because as you said, I think it's a really important conversation that is not being had enough, and we need to continue to have it more and more. So I hope that, these kind of conversations can continue too.
Well, I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this conversation. If you haven't already, please go ahead and leave a review on iTunes. Thanks again so much for listening, and we'll see you soon for another episode.